The subcommittee will come to order. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous material for the record subject to length limitations in the rules. I'm excited to be here today because we meet today to discuss South Asia nations of the Indian Ocean region, a group of states that are small in number but more and more consequential on the world stage. Bangladesh, India, the Maldives, Nepal, Sri Lanka are also becoming more central to the U.S. foreign policy and national security. These nations collectively include over 1.5 billion residents, about a fifth of the world's population. They are located along vital global sea lanes through the Indian Ocean, which grow more strategically important by the day, connecting vital straits and rising Asian economies in the east with the rest of the world and its energy to the west. The Indian Ocean has significant implications for security and trade across the globe. The Trump administration has taken a holistic view of Asia understanding, and the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean are deeply interconnected. President Trump, Secretary Pompeo, and Administrator Green have all championed the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which places an increased emphasis on South Asia. The concept has received broad support, but the administration has yet not provided many details about how this critical strategy will be resourced or implemented. I hope that our witnesses can shine some light on this today, because the United States is not the only power that is turning its attention to the Indian Ocean region. The People's Republic of China has sought to expand its influence worldwide through its Belt and Road Initiative, a program that raises substantial concerns for U.S. and regional security, international norms, and global democracy. The Indian Ocean is the most important crossroads for this massive Eurasian development push. The Belt and Road Initiative, a phenomenon unlike anything else American foreign policy has addressed before, will have major implications in South Asia's future. Sri Lanka Hambantota port is the most notable example of how China can induce struggling countries to take on debt they cannot pay back, later using this leverage to increase control, and we're seeing this more and more around the world. Sri Lanka was forced to hand over its strategic port and 15,000 acres of its land for 99 years and still owes billions of dollars to Chinese-controlled firms. Through the Indo-Pacific strategy, the United States is putting forward a very different proposal for the region, one that would protect freedom and openness instead of relying on bribery and predation. We're making some progress in operationalizing the idea using new tools like the BUILD Act legislation that we authored, and it's passed out of this committee and it's passed out of the House and shortly out of the Senate, to modernize U.S. development finance, which passed the House this month. But ultimately, the United States can't and shouldn't compete with China's Belt and Road dollar for dollar. Over the last few years, at its highest, U.S. assistance to South Asia was $472 million in fiscal year 2017. The FY 2019 budget request was a significant reduction of more than half of 2017's assistance at only $219 million. So instead, our diplomats need to be creative, effective, and properly resourced. Apart from these important regional strategic considerations, South Asia presents a diverse spread of intractable other foreign policy challenges. In the last year, 700,000 plus Rohingya have fled ethnic cleansing in Burma to seek refuge in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is still a developing country in its own right, is still struggling to support a massive population of refugees which are constantly at risk from monsoon floods, health crises, and other disasters. The stories have faded from international headlines since the explosion of violence from Burma's Tatamada last August, but the Rohingya crisis remains one of the world's most urgent humanitarian emergencies. Bangladesh faces a host of other challenges: militancy, extrajudicial killings, and a troubled electoral season, to name just a few. The Maldives is headed for an election, but remains in an extended crisis of democracy and is subject of intense Chinese influence. Nepal has been racked by devastating natural disasters in recent years and is struggling to address its development needs while determining its political future in places in the region. As the Indian Ocean becomes more central to U.S. foreign policy, our diplomatic and development efforts must address all these challenges and many, many more. The South Asian region has the demographic potential to transform the world, but presents equally intractable problems. The administration should be commended for recognizing the region's importance, but we must follow through, so it is essential that the U.S. engagement is properly targeted and resourced. I thank the witnesses for joining us today to discuss how the administration plans to allocate resources among our critical regions in the South Asia region. And I now turn to our ranking member, Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Today's hearing covers India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and the Maldives. In the past 4 years, our annual foreign aid to these countries has averaged $400 million. The President proposes that we cut this to $219 million. There's a natural focus to say, well, what we're spending in these countries is the foreign aid budget. We should also keep in mind that the most significant contribution America makes to the world is the maintenance of peace and security and safety for democracies. We spend $1 trillion of that on that every year. If we were to think that only 1/10 of that were to be spent in the South Asian region, that's $10 billion. That's $100 billion, which of course dwarfs what we actually spend on foreign aid. I start with $1 trillion as our defense budget. This is just kind of a footnote. Our foreign policy establishment tries to state that figure as a much lower item in order to hide from liberals the fact that we're spending so much on defense and hide from conservatives the fact that we're spending so much more than our allies. But the fact is that you can't exclude the CIA and the VA from the costs of maintaining a military. The chairman points out the question is, how are we going to resource and implement our efforts in South Asia? When it comes to resourcing, the President wants to cut USAID to the area by half. And when it comes to implement, the President hasn't bothered to appoint anybody to any permanent position in the whole South Asia Bureau of the State Department. So aside from not having the people to implement and not having the money to resource, all of his strong talk about the Indo-Pacific region, well, it appears to be just talk. We need to strengthen democracy in the region. Freedom House scores the region as a region at 3.7 on a scale of 7, where 1 is the highest. This is better than the 4.8 score for Southeast Asia as a region. The per capita income in the area is only $6,700 measured by purchasing power, which is 40% less than Southeast Asia. Overall, South Asia has a population of 1.5 billion, and last year's USAID budget was $470 million. That is very small per capita, and the reason for it is that we give almost nothing to India. If you look at the countries we're considering today, other than India, the per capita amount is considerably more than we spend in Southeast Asia, for example. We have a strategic partnership with India. They purchased $15 billion worth of arms from U.S. defense firms. While we export $50 billion last year, we still have a $27 billion trade deficit, and I'll be asking Ambassador Wells what we can do to reduce that. With Bangladesh, we have to commend Bangladesh for being willing to host 700,000 Rohingyas who have been pushed out of Burma. Our aid supports those refugees and democracy and economic needs in Bangladesh. Last year, Nepal had its first parliamentary elections in 20 years. Our assistance helps political and economic development in that country. And in Sri Lanka, democracy is as old there as India, but it lags behind in the area of minority rights, particularly for the Tamil community. Progress has been slow on a federal constitution giving autonomy to the Tamil regions. More needs to be done on accountability for human rights and the human rights violations that occurred during the Civil War, and on ending military control of civilian property in Tamil areas. 2 months ago, on Sri Lanka's Remembrance Day, I expressed my concerns on this in the congressional record. Then there's the Maldives. At the budget hearing 2 years ago, I said the president of the Maldives was crushing democracy. Unfortunately, that continues to be true. And of course, we must remember that well over 200 Maldivians are estimated to have traveled to fight and live under ISIS. As to burden sharing, Europe spends over $1 billion in annual aid to the region, Japan $200 million, Australia provides $100 million. That sounds like they're doing more, but they can afford to do so because they're not paying for their own defense. And therefore, we would expect that it would be these allies that would do far more than they have to bring about economic development and democracy in South Asia. So with that, I look forward to discussing our foreign aid budget, but keeping in mind that the $1 trillion we spend on defending democracy around the world dwarfs everything that we're doing in foreign aid and even dwarfs what our allies are doing on foreign aid, and I yield back.
Thank you for your comments. Next, we'll go to Mr. Rohrbacher from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing together and trying to create a dialogue among Americans about what our policies should be like, considering that there are changes going on in Asia and South Asia in particular. What we have got and what we need to recognize that the world is not the same as it was 20 and 30 years ago. What has emerged is a partnership, an alliance, so to speak, between Pakistan and India, an alliance that is hostile to the basic tenets of democracy and hostile to its neighbors. India has every reason to be alarmed by this new cooperation and coordination between China and Pakistan. Pakistan, who is immersed and its leaders are immersed in radical Islam and terrorism, not only to terrorize their neighbors, but to terrorize their own populations into submission. And in Pakistan, where you've got Sindhis who are being brutalized and murdered, we have to recognize this group who believes in peace and are not in any way threatening to others. They are being murdered. They grab and dump their bodies. The MQM in Karachi as well, another group dedicated to democracy. And the Baluch, an individual tribe in Pakistan. These groups of people are being brutalized by this corrupt government in Islamabad in alliance now with China, which of course is the world's worst human rights abuser, and they not only have no opposition parties, but anybody like the Falun Gong who peacefully express their opposition to this brutality and this repression that the Chinese government has on its millions of people. They themselves become victimized, and there's stories about Falun Gong being put in jail and their organs being harvested and sold, maybe even to some Westerners. These are things we need to pay attention to so that the people of the world will rise up together. The good people can rise up together behind those people in Pakistan and in China who are suffering so much needlessly. Thank you very much, and thanks for holding this hearing.
Thank you for your comments, and next we'll go to Dr. Ami Bera from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll keep my comment short. First off, Ambassador Wells-Masteel, thank you for your service to our country and your representation of our nation abroad. As I think about it, we should make sure that the President's budget request, which is a huge cut to the region, is not a reflection of how Congress looks at the importance of the region. From the congressional side, I hope as we do our oversight and our budgeting process, we realize and reallocate and reemphasize the strategic importance of the region. When we think about the Indo-Pacific, certainly from an economic perspective, the growing relationship and growing trading relationship between the United States and India and the region is incredibly important. When we think about the strategic importance and partnership that's happening in maritime security between the United States and India, incredibly important. The partnership that's occurring trilaterally and quadrilaterally between Japan, the United States, India, Australia, incredibly important to maintaining the stabilization of the Indian Ocean region as well as the maritime security there. So, I'm happy that the President does use the term Indo-Pacific. I think it does emphasize the importance of the region, and I think we should applaud what the Bangladeshi people have done in terms of helping and absorbing the Rohingyas population that has been displaced. It can't be easy. We do have a global duty to help this humanitarian crisis and find some resolution. And again, I look forward to the questions, and I'll yield back.
Any other members wish to have an opening statement? Hearing none, we are thankful to be joined today by two repeat customers. Appreciate you coming back. The Honorable Alice G. Wells, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary to the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Thank you for coming back. Ms. Gloria Steele, Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Asia and the U.S. Agency for International Development, otherwise known as USAID. We'll start with you, Ms. Wells. You know how the lights work and all that, and hopefully stay within the time limits of 5 minutes. Thank you, and go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Yoho and Ranking Member Sherman and members of the subcommittee for inviting me today to discuss the administration's 2019 budget request for South Asia. Today, my testimony will cover our requests for India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and the Maldives. The Indo-Pacific region, spanning from the west coast of the United States to the west coast of India, hosts 70% of global commerce within its maritime domain alone. And as the Indo-Pacific's largest trading partner and investor, the United States conducts $1.4 trillion in two-way trade with its markets, benefiting from $850 billion in foreign direct investment. The region has achieved this through a shared commitment between the United States and its allies and partners to a free, open, and rules-based system. The Indo-Pacific strategy, announced during the President's historic trip to Asia in November, seeks to strengthen that order, protecting the sovereignty of all Indo-Pacific nations to chart their own path forward. The strategy will ensure the freedom of the seas and skies, promote market economies, and support good governance, transparency, and liberty. South Asia is a market of more than 1.5 billion people, critical to our national security. For India, the administration supports India's emergence as a leading global power and is committed to strengthening our strategic and defense partnership. We look forward to working with Congress to deepen the links between our two great democracies. As India's #1 trading partner, purchasing close to 20% of India's goods and service exports annually, the United States is working to ensure fair and reciprocal trade for American companies and achieve greater balance in our trade deficit. We're also facilitating greater regional engagement with our other South Asian partners who have expanding populations, dynamic economies, and ambitions of their own to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific. Bangladesh, strategically positioned at the crossroads between South and Southeast Asia, is an important venue in the fight against transnational terrorism. But this developing country is now hosting more than 1 million Rohingya refugees from neighboring Burma. We have an interest in helping Bangladesh bear this burden so the country can remain peaceful and stable. The U.S. has committed $190 million to Bangladesh for this crisis since last year. For Sri Lanka, we will support its commitments to constitutional reform, fighting corruption, human rights, post-Civil War reconciliation, transitional justice, and accountability. Adopting these principles is the only way to help resolve long-standing ethnic and religious conflicts and usher in a more stable and prosperous future. Nepal, located between two of the largest economies in the Indo-Pacific region, is entering a new era of political stability. The administration will continue to assist Nepal in its efforts to develop its infrastructure and regional connectivity, most prominently through the Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact. Finally, the United States encourages Maldives to hold free and fair democratic elections in line with the Indo-Pacific region's values. For fiscal year 2019, the department requests $219.3 million for South Asia, sufficient to meet our objectives. This includes $120.9 million for Bangladesh, $42.1 million for India, $40.5 million for Nepal, $11.5 million for Sri Lanka, $400,000 for the Maldives, and $3.9 million in regional funding for South Asia. We also look forward to working with Congress to determine future funding needs for the Indo-Pacific. Reflecting the importance the administration attaches to the region, on July 30th, Secretary Pompeo will join Secretaries Perry, Ross, and OPIC President Washburn to headline the Indo-Pacific Business Forum in Washington. Soon after, Secretary Pompeo will travel to Singapore to participate in the ASEAN ministerials and discuss the future of the Indo-Pacific with his counterparts. And Secretaries Pompeo and Mattis will hold a 2+2 dialogue with India on September 6th in New Delhi. We look forward to the committee's review of this budget request and hope that we can find ways to further support the prosperity and sovereignty of South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Wells. Next, Ms. Steele. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Sherman, distinguished subcommittee members, thank you very much for inviting me today to testify on USAID's role in South Asia to advance the objectives of the Indo-Pacific Strategy, the South Asia Strategy, and USAID's support for partner countries on their journey to self-reliance. USAID's fiscal year 2019 request contributes to the administration's Indo-Pacific strategy of advancing free, open, and rules-based order. To this end, USAID will support programs that help partner countries to strengthen their democratic systems, ensure that their trade, infrastructure, and investment programs are transparent, open, and free of corruption, and encourage responsible management of natural resources upon which our partner countries depend for their long-term growth. To strengthen democratic systems, USAID will promote the integrity of electoral processes, support the independence of media and information integrity, implement anti-corruption initiatives, and amplify the voice of the civil society. In Nepal, for example, for fiscal year 2019, resources will help educate the government on its roles and responsibilities as it transitions to a federal form of government. In Sri Lanka, funds will strengthen parliamentary oversight committees and key ministries to foster transparency and accountability. To strengthen economic governance, fiscal year 2019 resources will support programs that focus on fostering competitiveness, trade facilitation, and responsible infrastructure development, including the transformation of the energy sectors. And this will be in Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, and India. We will also look for opportunities to assist countries to improve their tax administration and financial management in order to reduce their vulnerability to debt traps. Finally, USAID will help improve natural resource-related legal frameworks and foster better enforcement of environmental safeguards, such as in Bangladesh. Irresponsible natural resources management undermines long-term growth, and non-transparent natural resource extraction often breeds corruption. Our fiscal year 2019 budget request will also support the goals of the South Asia Strategy. Our programs will deepen our strategic partnership with India, support its efforts in fostering regional stability, and promote regional connectivity of South Asia and Central Asia countries. Helping countries on their journey to self-reliance is good development. As my administrator, Administrator Green, has often said, and I quote, "We believe that every person, every community, and every country wants to be empowered to lead their own journey to self-reliance. Accordingly, we will stand by them and prioritize local capacity, engage private sector in the growth process, and help partner countries mobilize domestic and international resources in order to help them in their development process. We will help countries develop their capacity and commitment to make clear, informed policies and advance their development and attract legitimate investors and trading partners." I will now give examples of programs that we have to help countries become self-reliant. Let me start with Bangladesh. Despite being well on its way to graduating from least developed country status, much remains to be done to accelerate Bangladesh's journey to self-reliance. Our budget request will support Bangladesh's efforts in health, education, and food security, all of which are important to its development. We will also continue to help in strengthening their democratic institutions and addressing the drivers of extremism in that country. The Bangladesh's response to Rohingya crisis highlights their tremendous generosity. The magnitude of the crisis, however, underscores the importance of support from international community. In May 2018, I accompanied Administrator Green to Bangladesh and to Burma to assess the humanitarian crisis and the response. We urge further action and assistance for the refugees and host communities. In Nepal, our budget requests will continue to support the agriculture sector, support private sector development, and the expansion of country's hydroelectric power. We will continue working with the government to make public financial management systems more transparent and accountable. And finally, we will support Nepal's earthquake reconstruction efforts and its successful health and education programs. In Sri Lanka, our budget requests will continue to strengthen the government's ability to finance its own development and level the playing field for firms to engage with government, especially on infrastructure projects. Having supported development and passage of the National Audit Bill, we will continue to strengthen the government's oversight of public funds, which requires state-owned enterprises to publish audited financial statements. We are also helping the government to create the first electronic procurement secretariat in order to increase transparency and accountability. And finally, in India, our FY 2019 request will enable USAID to support the government's national campaign for TB-free India by 2025. This is one of the largest and most important TB initiatives in the world. We will also support the country's water, sanitation, and hygiene program. We will assist the government to scale up successful interventions by generating private sector contributions through innovative financing arrangement. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your support of USAID's programs in South Asia, including enabling us to provide health, education, and livelihood services to Tibetan communities in India and Nepal. With our fiscal year 2019 budget requests, we are committed to making the most out of every taxpayer dollar we receive to ensure that our partner countries move forward on their journeys to self-reliance and that we achieve the objectives of the South Asia and the Indo-Pacific strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. I appreciate both of your testimonies. At this point, we're going to break a little bit. We're going to go to Ms. Ann Wagner from Missouri and start with her, and then we'll go to the ranking member.
Boy, it's Christmas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for hosting this hearing. I thank our witnesses for their tremendous service. Dr. Wells, welcome back. Let me ask you, the Thomson Reuters Foundation found that India is the most dangerous country in the world for women. In India, this runs even deeper than rape and sexual violence due to female infanticide, sex-selective abortions, and childhood neglect. 63 million women are missing from the Indian population. How does U.S. programming in South Asia address gendercide in India?
Thank you, and I'll also ask Gloria to comment, but we have a range of programs that we undertake with the civil society to promote gender equality and to empower women. I would note that as a democracy, this is the subject of enormous debate inside of India, and I think we respect the fact that Indian institutions, the media, civil society are engaged on this very important issue.
Ms. Steele.
Yes, thank you very much. In all of our programs, in India in particular, recognizing the problem that you just identified, we have made sure that we work with the government to identify the gender issues related to health. In health in particular, our programs make sure that we work with them on the issues related to men versus women. We also have sensitivity programs with them. And we have talked to them about the issues that you have just pointed out, and our maternal and child health programs provide an emphasis in looking into the issues that you've just pointed out.
How do you anticipate the heightened demand for women will affect human trafficking in the region, and what is the United States doing to prepare for changes in trafficking patterns? Ms. Wells.
I think we've already seen, for instance, in China, where there is a gender imbalance, that creates trafficking concerns. And so through our dialogues with the region, including with India, these are the subjects that we do take up. How do you protect women, ensure their rights, and educate societies about the societal costs of these policies that discriminate against women?
63 million women missing. India and China have clashed repeatedly over territories in the Himalayas. Most recently, Chinese and Indian troops faced off on the disputed Doklam Plateau between Bhutan and China after the Chinese People's Liberation Army began building roads through the area. Although both countries backed down, China has quietly resumed its activities in Doklam, and neither Bhutan nor India have sought to dissuade it. Ambassador Wells, China's activities in the Himalayas remind me of its South China Sea policies. How should our failure to respond to the militarization of the South China Sea inform the international response to these Himalayan border disputes?
I would assess that India is vigorously defending its northern borders, and this is a subject of concern to India as it looks ahead to its own strategic stability. It certainly helps drive and is a factor in driving a closer partnership that we enjoy with India. And as we look to the Indo-Pacific strategy put forward by this administration, the goal, it's taken in light of the South China Sea strategy. How do we maintain the region to be open, to have maritime security, to not have militarization that would imperil the 70% of global trade? And we need to do that by giving authority to sovereign nations to have choices in how they develop, to have choices in their partnerships. And that's the goal that's being undertaken comprehensively and will be discussed at this forum on July 30th.
Look forward to the forum. Ms. Deal, in my limited time, USAID has put forward reforms to ensure a more effective approach to development and humanitarian programs, including creating bureaus for humanitarian assistance, resilience and food security, and conflict prevention and stabilization. With your experience co-chairing the working group between state and USAID, can you give the committee an update on those reforms and how they are being implemented? I realize I've left you no time. You can certainly respond, I suppose, in writing too.
Sure.
I thank the chair for his indulgence, and I look forward to that response in writing.
We will
Thank you.
provide.
I yield back.
Thank you, Ann. And next, we'll go to the ranking member, Mr. Sherman of California.
They say be careful what you wish for. I would hope that the State Department would be staffed by people properly appointed by the administration. We have Ambassador Wells here, who could be appointed Assistant Secretary for South Asia, but instead appears before us now as PDAS because you can no longer be Assistant Secretary, Acting Assistant Secretary, because you were in an Acting Assistant Secretary position for so long. I say be careful what you wish for because I'm not sure I want everyone in Foggy Bottom to be wearing MAGA hats. I might prefer an administration that doesn't fill positions. I hope they fill positions with people that are capable, who have the resume, the background, the experience, and are empowered by having a permanent position. Again, maybe I should settle for what we have. Ambassador Wells, I think we talked about this earlier. You're a PDAS in the Bureau. Is there any other person in the entire Bureau who has been appointed by this administration?
I am the PDAS in the Bureau. I have acting DASs, 4 acting DASs who assist me in the conduct of SCA's policy.
Okay, so the 4 people under you are acting, and the person over you would be acting and would be you, except you were acting for so long you can't be acting anymore. So we have 4 positions under your PDAS position and 1 position above your PDAS position, representing 5 of the 6 most important positions in the in the Bureau, all of which have not been appointed by this administration. Again, I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It would depend on who they would appoint. I want to move on to Pakistan. Ms. Steele, you escaped these questions, but Ambassador Wells's area includes Pakistan. Last November, I raised the case from a human rights perspective of Dr. Anwar Laghari, a law-abiding, nonviolent leader from Sindh who was assassinated in 2015. And then his only son, Assad, was found dead under mysterious circumstances. I'm also concerned with hundreds of other Sindhi activists who remain missing, including Hid Lala Lohar, Nangar Chana, and just this week, a young man named Atif Chandiro, who has apparently been disappeared by Pakistani security agents. And of course, his cousin is missing, and his daughter is receiving death threats from Pakistani agencies. Earlier this year, Ambassador Wells, you sent me a letter that addressed Anwar Laghari and stated in part that you will continue to press the government of Pakistan to ensure a thorough and impartial investigation. Can I count on you to continue to do that with regard to those cases and the additional cases I brought up?
Yes, very much so. We continue to raise the case of Mr. Laghari, and I understand his brother is here in the audience, and we had an opportunity to discuss this as well. We were seeing public protests, popular protests against the disappearances, against staged encounters, and I think this is very much on the as a leading part of the political dialogue right now in Pakistan, the rule of law and the relationship of the political establishment to its people.
I'll go on to a question for the record, and that is, we are loath as a country to urge the change of any international border. We did support eventually independence for Eritrea, but the more relevant example is South Sudan. The government of Sudan was oppressing the people of South Sudan, killing by the thousands its own citizens. We see the same in Burma, where the Rohingya have been forced in numbers of roughly of many hundreds of thousands out of their own country. And North Rakhine State is on all our international maps as part of Burma. But Burma seems to have, or Myanmar, seems to have provided the same level of governance to North Rakhine State as Khartoum provided to South Sudan. And so I realize this affects not only your bureau, but the East Asia Bureau. How many people does the Myanmar military have to kill before the United States would recognize that North Rakhine State should be independent or join with Bangladesh, rather than continue to be part of the territory of a country that has killed by the many thousands? So I'd ask you to respond to that. For the record, I don't know if there's a number, but perhaps we can draw a line somewhere about whether we should draw a border on a map that shows North Rakhine State as part of a country that has killed so many of the people who live there. I'll ask the chairman's indulgence to then ask you a question about India. Would the purchase of Russian S-400 surface-to-air missiles result in a violation of I don't know how we pronounce it, CAATSA sanctions, which of course are our sanctions against Russia, and how do ties between India and Iran affect our relationship with India, particularly with regard to oil purchases, and have we asked India to purchase less oil from Iran?
I can't address the hypothetical of an S-400 sale, but I can underscore the administration and the State Department's commitment to enforcing the CAATSA sanctions.
Would the purchase of Russian S-400s trigger CAATSA sanctions?
I mean, if there is a purchase of S-400, the administration will have to review that purchase. I'm not in a position today to answer that question. On JCPOA, we've been in discussion.
I would say the Indians might benefit from us telling them in advance rather than waiting for them to do something in ignorance of what our position is and then hitting them with sanctions because they did something we wouldn't tell them in advance they shouldn't do. But go on.
Under the JCPOA, we've been engaging with all of the partners and international community on support for the sanctions that are being reimposed on Iran. And as part of that discussion, we have raised with India the need and our expectation that India will reduce its imports of crude oil. What we've seen in the past is that private sector companies responding to the sanctions do respond to these forces.
I thank the chairman for the additional time. I yield back.
Thank you for your question. Next, we'll go to Mr. Scott Perry from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, ladies, for being here and for your testimony and your service. Ms. Steele, I'm particularly interested in Bangladesh and the way you characterized it. I mean, and I don't know, you used a metaphor which escapes me at the moment regarding kind of like going through school, right? For some of these countries, like they're progressing on their way, right? And I don't, but because what I wrote down is, do any of them ever graduate? Is my question. Do any of them ever graduate from this progression towards where the United States hopes they'll be? And we hope they do. I'm just asking if we have any of those success stories where at some point we're just good friends with those folks and they're good friends with us and they do their thing and we do ours and we buy stuff from them and sell stuff and everybody's happy. Do we get to that point anywhere in this area of the world?
I use the term journey to self-reliance.
Yes, there you go.
That's right. Actually, going back to Bangladesh, Bangladesh is very, very close to transitioning from a least developed country status. So it's actually making progress. And that's what we're intending to do, is to help countries move them along so that they move on and be able to be in complete control of their development, be able to make decisions about their development, be able to fund them themselves and attract investments from others, not just be on the dole.
But even though they're on the journey and even though they're progressing, they're far from where we hope they will eventually be. So it's not like we're going to help them this far, and then when they complete that portion of the journey, we're out, right? We're going to.
Bangladesh itself has made tremendous progress, but it is far from being a higher income, higher middle income country. But it is showing, the potentials for being that. You asked for examples. One example is in the region of Asia is South Korea. I still remember when I started my career with AID that I had colleagues working with me who just came from Korea. And that dates me, but my point is that we do have success stories when countries are committed and are capacitated to take on the journey on their own. They do succeed. Another region is in Eastern Europe and Eurasia, where I worked for 9 years. And we did help a number of countries be on a journey, complete the journey to being self-reliant, and they are now.
And I'm glad you mentioned South Korea. I've had the privilege of visiting, and the country's wonderful, and so are the people. So I'm privileged to know that. Let me ask you a little more about Bangladesh. You mentioned health security, and I think civil society or institutional capacity. In that context, and the other things that you mentioned, it seems to me one of the biggest things that we can assist with or advocate for is free and open democratic elections there. And I just wonder where we stand with that and where that is on the list of priorities.
It is a high priority. In fact, among the countries in South Asia, we have allocated the biggest amount for democracy and governance programs. We're working with civil society, youth groups, and various groups in order to make sure that the voice of the people are heard in the coming elections. We're working to make sure that the elections are going to be free, open, and transparent. And we have been working with them for several months now, in fact, over a year, which is what is necessary. We can't just work on the day off or after.
Well, we're very interested in Congress to see the outcome of that, and I just wanted to impress upon that fact upon you. Ambassador, I see that you want to add some.
No, it's very much part of our political dialogue. The last elections were not contested by the major opposition party, and that detracts, from the strength of the government. And when I met today with the foreign minister of Bangladesh, I reiterated what our Ambassador Bernakat in Dhaka, has been underscoring privately and publicly, the need for a contested and fair election.
Okay. In the time remaining, I just would like to get an update on the Rohingya situation as well. We have addressed it in this committee on several occasions, but in my opinion, it's just conversation, right? Nothing, maybe nothing that America can do would make a difference, but we lament that situation, and we'd love to see any kind of forward progress on their behalf. Can you let us know where this conversation fits in, or where they fit into this conversation?
We support the safe and voluntary and dignified return of the Rohingya home. And while we welcome the fact that Bangladesh and Burma have negotiated an MOU for the return of refugees, our position continues to be that the situation in Rakhine has to be satisfactory for that safe return. And so the conditions on the ground in Burma have to demonstrate to the people that when they return, they will not face ethnic cleansing, that they will have opportunities to live in peace. So I think we're faced with two challenges, both the political challenge of reinforcing to the military leadership in Burma to uphold the commitments made by their civilian leadership, and at the same time the challenge of ensuring that Bangladesh isn't pulled back further from its own development goals because of this enormously generous decision to take in 1 million Rohingya.
Right. So even though the MOU may be out there, is it your studied opinion at this point that it is unsafe? It remains unsafe for them to return?
That's been the UN's judgment,
right.
And I think we have to also look to the people. They have to be prepared to return, and I think the overwhelming majority are not at this moment prepared to return given current conditions.
You can't say you blame them, right?
Right.
All right, thank you. I yield.
Thank you for the questions. Dr. Bera from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleague from California, Mr. Sherman, brought up a couple points. I know both you, Ambassador Wells and Ms. Steele, if it was up to you, you don't want the title of acting. You'd certainly like to fill positions, et cetera. But again, I'll reiterate, thank you for showing up every day, doing your job, and convey back to the career employees at Foggy Bottom that we thank them as well, and our diplomats and State Department employees around the world. We might prefer different circumstances, but the fact that, and I think my colleague shares the same thing, that, and many of us in Congress, that, we appreciate your representing the United States of America around the world and showing up every day to do your job. Ambassador Wells, as over the past few years in my time in Congress, increasingly in a bipartisan way, bicameral way, there's been a sense that we wanted to grow our relationship strategically with India, and that the U.S.-India defense relationship in the Indo-Pacific was of huge strategic importance. And in fact, in last year's Congress in the NDAA, we required the administration, as we defined India as a major defense partner, we asked from the administration kind of a clarification of how they would define that. In addition, there was a request that the Secretaries of State and Defense jointly designate an individual that was responsible for spearheading the U.S.-India defense relationship, understanding that was to emphasize the importance of that relationship. Would you be able to give us an update on that definition, if it's happened, as well as who our quarterback's going to be on the U.S.-India defense relationship, if there's been a decision made on that?
Thank you, and to both you and Representative Sherman. I do want to underscore the full support that I've received from Secretary Pompeo, which I appreciate, in the prosecution of my job every day. On India, we're looking ahead to the September 6th 2+2, and the joining of forces between Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mattis to help define what major defense partnership is. And I think we're going to be able to demonstrate, both in terms of the progress we make on the agreements we can reach that will make it easier for us to share classified information and undertake logistical activities together. We're also demonstrating it through the incredible growth in our defense sales relationship, from essentially zero in 2008 to what we expect will be $18 billion by 2019, with other major purchases on the horizon. And then the on-the-ground activities, whether it's the Malabar exercise and the fact that we do more military exercises with India than we do with any other country in the world. And so giving meaning and definition to how we can work together to secure the Indo-Pacific region. Instead of one point person, I think you're getting a fusion of state and defense efforts. For instance, when India sent its foreign secretary and defense secretary, they too adopted that 2+2 format. And so we're working together hand in glove diplomatically and militarily to build out the dimensions of what Secretary Pompeo has said is one of our most critical relationships.
Right. And, my colleague from California also brought up the CATSA issue. While I'm not part of the NDAA conference committee, my sense is that they did address this issue in conference and, made some adjustments to the language, because it's our sense that, while India may have purchased equipment from Russia in the future, their real desire is to partner more closely with the United States. And I think they're, giving that flexibility to, folks in our DOD and State Department to make sure that we're not losing any of our equipment and our intellectual property and technology to potential adversaries. And we don't see India as an adversary. And again, I think as that 2+2 dialogue takes place, et cetera, I think it's important for us to continue to send the message that we do see India as a major defense ally and someone that is incredibly important, and a country that is incredibly important in helping us stabilize that region. I'm running out of time, but Ms. Steele, just a quick question is I think about, I think you traveled with Ambassador Green to Bangladesh and saw the conditions on the ground firsthand. When Ambassador Green was here a few months ago, he also talked about some of the worry of the rainy season and certainly where the refugees are at lower territory. I don't know exactly the timing of the rainy season in Bangladesh, but I'd assume that we're close to it if we're not in the middle of it right now. And can you give us an update on the actual conditions in the camps right now?
We are in the middle of the cyclone season. In fact, it's about to end, and another cyclone season starts in October. And in the meantime, I sent a team to go out to Bangladesh in order to look at potential areas that we can, multi-purpose buildings that we can reinforce to provide shelter for the people, for both the host communities and the refugees along Cox's Bazar. And the team talked to other donors in the area in order to get our heads together and see what we can do. In the meantime, right now, they're fine. I mean, we worried more. Fortunately, we did not get the strength of cyclone that we were concerned about, but October is coming, and so we are preparing for that.
Well, thank you. And again, thank you and your colleagues and for your service. And I think I speak for the entire committee. Thank you.
I think that'd be fair to say, and I appreciate your questions and your comments. Moving on, I think it was you, Ms. Steele. You said we believe in every country wants to determine their own self-reliance, and I think that's so true. And we see India graduating, and moving in that direction, and Bangladesh, moving from an LCD or LDC. What is it? Can we look at anything in our programs via aid that stands out in facilitating their transition? Because it's like running for Congress or when I went to vet school, there was a lot of people that were doubtful and they weren't real helpful, but once you make it, it says, I knew you'd make it all the time. It was the help we gave you. Is there any programs that we can look at definitively through USAID that says this led to this, that we can repeat over and over again in different countries? And I know each different country is a different situation, but is there anything that sticks out? Was it good governance? Was it developing economies via infrastructure, banking systems, rule of law? So I'd like to hear both of you comment on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, it isn't just one thing, and it really depends on where in the journey a particular country is. For example, just as an example, India. India's development is constrained by its very poor health situation. It has the highest number of TB cases in the world. It is the third highest number of HIV cases, and it accounts for 20% of maternal and child mortality. And so that's where we focus to help them move them along. But the good thing about India is that it does have the resources and it has the technology. So we provide them models of how you address specific issues, and they scale it up. And that is the kind of partnership that we have with them. India then would be different from another country like Nepal or Sri Lanka. So it would depend. But in general, if you want me to just talk about it in general, it is really a combination of good governance, strong democratic system, and an ability to be able to have a good regulatory environment so that they can generate resources on their own.
Let me interrupt you because you were saying that they didn't have the resources. When I look at a country like India, there's the largest democracy, of course, we're the oldest, and you say they don't have the resources, yet they have nuclear weapons, they have other things. Is it a problem with prioritizing? Because we know what causes TB, we know how to get rid of it, we know how to isolate it. You know, there's a massive amount of rabies that shouldn't be running rampant over there, and we know how to deal with that. So is it a prioritization that we can help better direct funds or strategies, I guess?
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry if I said they have the resources, but
Okay,
they
I'm
don't
sorry,
have
I'm
the
sorry.
technical capability.
Strike
So
the
what we
record
do
out.
is provide them the technical capacity, and they use their resources to scale up the programs that we
Okay.
work with them on.
But you can't point to one program that we,
So in India, our focus would be in the health sector.
Okay.
Because that is their major concern.
What about
constraint.
Bangladesh?
In Bangladesh, unfortunately, it is many more issues there. And so we work with them on food security. It is our biggest food security program in South Asia. So we help them improve the technologies to be able to produce the food that they need or generate the revenues in order to be able to purchase the food they need. We also work with them on the education sector in order to develop the capacity that they will have. And more importantly, we work with them on their good governance and democratic system.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Wells, do you have any comments on that or input?
The only thing I would add is the concern we have that countries not mortgage their future or mortgage their development to unsustainable projects and lending. And that is a major focus of the Indo-Pacific, that what is taken on as debt is utilized in projects that will help lift the standards and the well-being and economic growth of the countries.
That's a good transition for me because that's something I wanted to talk about. You know, the importance of that whole region is incredible where we're going. And if you look at outside of India and China, that southern Asia-Pacific region, according to Admiral Harris, there will be more people living within that region than outside of it by 2050 in the world. And it shows you the strategic importance of that. And so with that, we see the aggressiveness of China with their high lending tactics. I was reading a report the other day that in Pakistan, they had lent a lot of money. They were expecting a 34% return on investment. I'd like to be in that fund. But unfortunately, countries can't return. They can't pay that back. And we saw what happened in Sri Lanka and, of course, in the Maldives. And then, you know, we see them encroaching on that. And that's what we're looking for is stability so that we can move forward, so that we can promote those things that have created the economic boom in this world. And we feel it's good governance. We also feel it's democracies where people have a choice because people are empowered. Empowered people run better governments in general. And we're seeing the antithesis of that coming through the, I guess it says Xi Jinping calls it socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is, as far as I'm concerned, is communism. He can call it whatever he wants. And their goal is to break up democracies. And, you know, we have to make sure that we're moving forward and understand that it's like that movie Bob. You know, you got to take baby steps, but understand they're going to fall down and move backwards a little bit. But if we're going forward, and so with that, when I look at the Maldives, it's 400,000 roughly people in that area, and they didn't have free and fair elections. And China had a strong influence and said that if India intercedes, they would see that as an act of aggression. What are your thoughts on how the best way to counter China in that region?
I agreed with your opening remarks that we shouldn't be seeking to compete with China dollar for dollar. That's not our strength. Our strength is what we bring to the table also is the private sector. And so instead of state parastatal lending on terms that may not be to the benefit of countries or their citizens, we're providing $850 billion in foreign direct investment in the region, which is far more than what has been injected by China. As well, we're still the single largest grant donor, and our assistance is designed to address exactly trade facilitation, what makes systems work, what promotes regional connectivity. The BUILD Act that you mentioned is something the department strongly, the administration strongly supports. We look forward to being able to harness all the levers that we have to make it easier for our private sector to engage more effectively in the region. And through our diplomacy, both whether it's in support of ASEAN and APEC, but also trilaterals with Japan and India, or the quadrilateral with Japan, Australia, and India. We're trying to gather like-minded countries who can bring resources to the table, who can coordinate assistance and efforts so as to provide countries with meaningful alternatives.
Ms. Steele?
Mr. Chairman, China flourishes when when the democratic systems are weak, or when there is transparency, or there is no transparency, and when there is corruption. And so, from AID's perspective, we work in 3 different areas. One is on strengthening democratic systems and making sure that the electoral processes are free and open. And we are working with civil society to make sure that voices are heard. And because when the democratic systems are weak, then China is able to come in.
Right.
And we are also working in the economic area on strengthening the governance. We want to make sure that the policies and the rules are free and open and rules-based. That keeps China from being able to flourish. And so we work with them in the area of competitiveness, in infrastructure development, in trade facilitation, et cetera. And we work with them on improving the procurement rules, because it is when the procurement rules are non-transparent that China is able to come in. And then finally, China is very interested in extractive resources, in the mines and minerals. And so we work with the countries to make sure that they are aware of the environmental consequences and the long-term consequences when they do not manage their resources properly.
Thank you, and I'm going to turn to the ranking member. If you have the time, the patience, and the tolerance to have another round of questions for both of us.
If that involves questions for me, we're asking for a very high level of patience and tolerance. I will disagree with just one thing with the chairman's remarks. I don't think what China calls socialism with Chinese characteristics is communism. I'm a progressive. I'm on the left. I know what a real communist is. And President Xi, you're no communist. You may be in favor of crony capitalism, you may be in favor of state-directed capitalism, but I know a real communist. I don't know if you met one. Anyway, now I want to put for the record into context. We're all talking about the $18 billion of arms purchases by India. That's what they're going to do over a 14-year period, whereas the trade deficit, and that's what I'm told, from 2005 to present, or maybe even a year or two into the future. Whereas the trade deficit is $27 billion per year. Ambassador Wells, is it official U.S. policy that we want to reduce or eliminate that trade deficit, or is that $27 billion trade deficit just hunky-dory?
The president wants fair and reciprocal trade, and I think when we look at India, there are 3 sectors where I think we can get a significant boost in our trade.
Do we have like a target, like, okay, by this year we'll cut that $27 billion to this figure or to that figure?
We'd like the trade deficit to be reduced as quickly as possible. We have a
But
trade
it's not
policy-
like we've got a target for 2020, or
No.
the Chinese are the ones with targets for 2020 and 2020. Okay, so we don't have a particular target. We just want to see the trade deficit reduced. I will ask you one other question. Let's say there was some policy that would increase our exports to India by $1 billion, but increase our imports from India by $2 billion, thereby creating $3 billion of additional bilateral trade. Is that something that we would look favorably upon, or not?
I'm going to have to defer to USTR, but what I'd like to underscore is
Well,
that
I
there
mean,
are trade policy forum discussions underway focused on eliminating or reducing both the tariffs and the non-tariff barriers that do exist. If our average tariff rate is about 3.5%, India's is over 13%. It's historically been a more closed market. We're pushing aggressively for medical devices, pharmaceuticals, dairy, agricultural products.
But we may, but that may add up to a lot or a little. I'm
But
gonna
if I
go-
could underscore the positive picture, which is in defense, aviation, and energy. In aviation alone, Boeing estimates that over the next 20 years, there's going to be $290 billion in aviation sales. Last year, we saw $22
Trade is
billion.
growing worldwide, numbers are getting bigger, but as the numbers get bigger, the trade deficits tend to get bigger. But I want to ask Ms. Steele, you're often going to be approached by brand name U.S. corporations, and they're going to be whistling America the Beautiful under their breath. And they're going to try to get you to finance something that they're going to call trade promotion that will lead to higher profits for that corporation, a good American corporation. And will increase total trade, but will actually increase the trade deficit and reduce jobs in the United States. Do you regard as trade promotion a project just because it's favored by a U.S. corporation that talks about its supply chains, or do you get an analysis as to whether this is going to lead to more jobs and a reduction of the trade deficit?
I too defer to USTR on that. We do not
Well,
do the
but,
trade
but
analysis.
wait a minute.
What we
You're
work
spending the money, and people will come to you with projects that say this foreign aid expenditure will help trade and supply chains, and you can't check with you don't check with USTR before you fund a road. So how do you analyze whether it's not just good for the country involved, but it's good for reducing the trade deficit, increasing jobs in the United States? Or are those just not factors you look at?
No, actually, we do consult with USTR before we implement any trade facilitation programs. We look at the needs of the country because
Are
it's a
they
development
looking at
assistance.
jobs, or are they just looking at profits for big U.S. corporations?
I-
Or
I-
or haven't they told you?
I don't know what they're looking at, but they do have a basis for making analysis of their trade, of the trade issues that they deal with.
Let's put, if they're anything like prior USTRs, they're just looking at what's in the interest of the profits of the big corporations, and they're not looking at the trade deficit, and they're not looking at jobs. So hopefully if you're funding any project that's supposed to be good for U.S. workers, find out whether it's good for U.S. workers, or just decide that that's not important to you. But for God's sakes, don't trust the bureaucracy over at USTR. I've got one more question for Ambassador Wells. We completed the U.S.-India civilian nuclear agreement a decade ago, so when will U.S. firms be able to sell nuclear power plants to India?
We continue to support the Westinghouse bid as Westinghouse comes out of bankruptcy. We have been in
That's
conversation.
a good American name, Westinghouse. Is a lot of U.S. jobs involved in that, or is that all Japanese jobs?
I believe that it also produces jobs on the U.S.
Well,
side
I'm sure
as
there's
well
some,
as.
but yeah.
I don't have the analysis in front of me. We can respond formally. But we, having done the hard work of creating a basis for a civilian nuclear relationship with India, having engaged seriously with India as they accede to the agreements, Wassenaar Australia Group, and hopefully in the future Nuclear Supplier Group, we would like to see this also manifested in our commercial relations with India, and we're very supportive of U.S. companies' efforts.
Can you respond for the
to build.
record? What are we going to do commercial, but also what portion of the jobs from Westinghouse or anything else that you're pushing will be here in the United States?
Sure.
Just because it has a venerable name it doesn't answer the question. Yield back.
Thank you for your questions. And I appreciate your input. I've got a couple comments here I want to do. One is on Bangladesh, and this is something, there is a lot of talk up here on the Rohingya crisis that's going on. And this is something Jerry Connolly wanted to be here today, but he couldn't be here. This is something that has to be dealt with. We do appreciate what Bangladesh has. I think they've gone over and above. One of my question was any assistance moved from Bangladesh to Burma or other countries in the region to deal with the refugees issues in Burma? Ambassador Wells?
No, we increased, we provided a net $190 million in assistance to Bangladesh above and beyond the existing bilateral assistance. There was some money also provided to deal with the Rohingya in Burma, and I'll defer to Gloria.
Ms. Steele?
Yes, we have provided assistance in Burma to deal with the Rohingya issue, as well as providing assistance to in the Cox's Bazar and the communities around it. But in Burma, we have provided $63 million to provide shelter, food assistance, nutrition, emergency nutrition, and livelihood development.
Okay. And as we move forward, our goal is to have a resolution that's acceptable to Burma, to the Rohingya, to Bangladesh as quick as we can, so that there's not more tragedy involved in that, and there's more stability that comes out of that, and that certainly is our goal. And I know we're separate branches of government, but we have the same goal. And the work you guys do is so vital that we continue to do that. And I have offered this to everybody pretty much that we talk to. Please use this branch of government as a way to move legislation forward. You're the ones that have the boots on the ground. You're the ones that have been in those countries. You know what works and what doesn't work, and you also know the what you're hampered by legislation. I'm giving you a pass, and I'm sure the ranking member Sherman would feel the same way, that if you say, if you guys could allow us to do this, we could do this better. Our whole goal is to move countries from aid to trade as fast as we can, and we want to duplicate that over and over again. And by doing that, we're going to develop economics and trade. And I'm excited about our BUILD Act because it changes the dynamics of what we can do. And as we do that, as you guys vet these programs, if that's in your wheelhouse, I think what Ranking Member Sherman brought up about jobs created. Yes, it's important for U.S. jobs, but I want to make sure we're doing those jobs within that country, because it's that infrastructure that leads to the economy, that leads to a higher standard of living, where countries will start finding their own way and be self-determining. And our program is so much different than what other countries offer, because we're not in there to suck out the resources. We're there to build strong alliances based on economies and trade. And if we do that, and we trade on a balanced and fair, level playing field, and we move in that direction, that we will be stronger allies and partners in the future. And that's our goal with this. And this is a tool we needed so badly, and we're just honored that it was able to pass out of here in the House. And I see we're joined by Mr. Connolly of Virginia. And go ahead, Jerry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did promise you on the floor I'd make it, but I had one hearing and one briefing all at the same time, so forgive me for being late. Let me ask either one of you or both of you, I'm particularly interested in the situation of the Rohingya. Reports I got months ago were that a number of the refugee camps in Bangladesh were up and running and functioning fairly well, actually. But their worry was the monsoon. What happens when the monsoon hits? Because then you're going to have, landslides, you're going to have damage to structures that are temporary, you're going to have washed out roads, and on and on. So where are we right now? The monsoons have begun. How much damage is there, and how worried should we be about their situation in temporary quarters that aren't all that robust and sturdy?
Thank you for that question. We are actually at the tail end of the cyclone season now. There's another cyclone season starting in October. 2 weeks ago, Ambassador Green and I, along with a PDAS from the State Department, went to visit both Bangladesh and Burma, and we were very concerned about the situation in both countries. We talked to various civil society organizations and the NGOs that we work with to understand better the situation. In fact, the lack of the inadequacy of cyclone-resistant shelters were raised as an issue, as well as the lack of land in that area to build additional shelters. The United States government has invested in building cyclone-resistant shelters in all of Bangladesh, but including in the Cox's Bazar. Other donors are doing the same thing, and the government of Bangladesh is doing the same thing. I sent an assessment team over 2 weeks ago to Bangladesh to take a look at other actions we may be able to take to strengthen existing structures that could be used for this purpose when the next cyclone season hits. And so we have a report on that now.
Well, I hope you'll keep this subcommittee, excuse me, posted and informed, because we're particularly interested in cyclone-resilient structures for refugees who already have suffered a great deal.
Yes, sir.
And their status remains up in the air. And we don't want them blown away with the cyclone while they're at it. So please keep us posted on that.
Yes, sir. We are also looking at shelters for host communities as well as
About what?
for the host communities as well as the refugees.
I understand, but my question has to do with the Rohingya.
Yes.
I mean, Bangladesh has lots of issues we could talk about. This is about a refugee population Bangladesh has been gracious enough to welcome that has been subject to ethnic cleansing and violence. And the least we can do is to try to make sure they've got safe, reliable shelter in their refugee communities that they've created especially that are resilient to the monsoon. Ambassador Wells, Bangladesh and Burma agreed to a voluntary repatriation timeframe in January of this year. Is that correct?
Yes.
What's the status of that agreement?
It depends. The agreement is premised on voluntary returns, and I think we've seen that the situation, and the UN has certainly judged that the situation in Rakhine State is not conducive to returns yet. You don't have the guarantees of safety or economic viability. We haven't seen refugees vote with their feet by trying to return to Rakhine. To the contrary, we're still seeing some flows of Rohingya coming from Burma. As we welcome the fact that Bangladesh and Burma are working together, and so as I said earlier, that we have a two-prong issue. We have to, I think, encourage the Burmese military to uphold the commitments that their civilian leadership has made, while simultaneously assisting Bangladesh so that they're not dragged backwards as a result of their generous hosting of this refugee population.
So, I mean, sometimes in international diplomacy, we have these wonderful breakthroughs. And sometimes it almost seems like we're checking boxes and going through the motions. So we got a voluntary repatriation timetable agreement. But meanwhile, we got the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights who called the atrocities that sparked the refugee crisis among the Rohingya, quote, a textbook example of ethnic cleansing, unquote. Why would anybody who's a Rohingya in Bangladesh want to voluntarily return to that prospect?
I think they would want to return under conditions of safety for reasons that their ties are there, their families are there, their land is there, their livelihood, their sense of self and community. But certainly to be subjected again to violence or ethnic cleansing is not something that we can condone or that they would voluntarily submit to.
Right. I mean, I'd call that kind of
And so the
common sense.
conversations, I mean, so the diplomacy underway is to achieve the changes in policy in Burma that will allow the Rohingya to return to Rakhine and to live safely. There is both security guarantees that are required. There are significant
Well, who, can I
societal
just,
discrimination.
I agree with you, but who would enforce that? Who's going to make sure that, say, on the Burmese side, they keep those commitments, assuming they make them?
I think we need the presence, I mean, we need our diplomacy, we need the broader international community, the UN agencies, all to be involved in this. I don't think that refugees will go back just because of a piece of paper. There's
Right.
going to have to be certitude.
Right. And I just think that's got to be key, and so far we don't have that.
No.
Right. So, so it's an aspirational thing, but it's not a real thing until we have that.
Yes,
Okay.
at this stage.
If the gentleman will yield.
Of course.
I would love to work on that with you, maybe letters to the UN, other agencies where we can put that and put some meat behind that.
I agree.
teeth.
And as I mentioned to you on the floor, I got one for you.
Got it right here.
Okay, good.
Told him what to do
Super.
it.
Hopefully we can collaborate. And in fact, that's how I, if it's all right, Mr. Chairman, just want to end. Ambassador Wells, are you familiar with the Amnesty International listing of, I guess it's 10 individuals in the Burmese military they've identified as guilty parties to the ethnic cleansing who should be held to account in terms of international justice? Are you aware of that?
I am not, and you've caught us in the division between the South and Central Asia Bureau and the East Asia Pacific Bureau, and so I've not focused as closely on the Burmese dimension of this, sir.
Okay, well, assuming Mr. Yoho and Mr. Berman and I can work together on this matter, we'll be glad to be in communication, because obviously this is a massive human rights crisis. And we want to see democracy flourish in Burma, but we also want to see individual human rights and collective human rights of a minority group protected. And so we're going to do our part to contribute to that protection. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you.
Thank you for coming by and participating. Appreciate you being here, and I appreciate your testimonies. We take this stuff, and a lot of times we've come out with pieces of legislation or support that has really made a difference, and we hope to continue to do that. And I think what I hear it over and over again, and I hear it all the time as I'm honored to be chair of this Asia-Pacific subcommittee, is it's America's presence, it's the rule of law, honoring contracts, and good governance. And certainly we have our own problems, but it still is a standard that a lot of the world looks up to. And so with that, I appreciate you being here. This subcommittee hearing is adjourned.